Hello everyone, my name's Chris from the Discover team. We've reached pretty much the end of the February instalment of Discover, and I hope everyone's had a really good time with the food and doing the activities and watching the crafts and all the different things that have been appearing in the Facebook group online. So I thought to round things up, it'd be really nice to take a quick, fun, short, easy look at Scotland's food throughout the ages. So if everyone is sitting comfortably, let's begin. Okay, so thinking about food in Scotland, I'm not going to try and say this phrase at the top of the screen. Now that's Gaelic and I have no idea how to pronounce it whatsoever. If we translate it into English, it translates as he who has contempt for food, fool. Now modern Scottish food has a pretty bad reputation. I'm sure we're all aware of this. We have lots of deep fried food, including deep fried chocolate bars. Our food is well known to be a little unhealthy, with little fruits, little vegetables, and hardly any fish as well. However, this is all rather strange because both in the past and now, Scotland has had a very rich larder and produces huge amounts of wonderful food. And in modern times, sadly, quite a lot of this goes abroad for export. We don't consume it here, which just seems a little bit daft. Now, thinking about longer ago in the past, ancient food that we ate in this country may have been very, very simple and was. However, it was pretty healthy and nutritious, and people generally ate pretty well. Some historians think that much longer ago in the past, people weren't smaller than they are now, but larger than they are now, because their diets were actually really quite good. What about modern Scottish food? Well, actually, we've got so much on offer, and we now have a wonderful international spread of nutritious, healthy, and tasty fare. So let's find out a little bit more. So, ancient Scotland, the very first settlers. The first hunter-gatherers arrived in Scotland after the First Ice Age, and the earliest evidence of humans in Scotland is flint tools they found, which are from about 12,000 BC. And if you look very closely at the top down right of the screen, you can see some images of these flint tools. So what is a hunter-gatherer? Well, a hunter-gatherer is a kind of early human. Well, they still exist actually in some places around the world, such as in the Amazon rainforest. And they get their food through, funnily enough, hunting and gathering, which means that they might not farm or grow things deliberately. They just take what they find around them. There was an early settlement that's found actually here in Edinburgh, Hammond, a little island. The hunter-gatherers, well, I've said this already, haven't I? They didn't farm animals or grow crops, they ate what they found around them, and you can see a picture there. So what did they eat? People hunted seals, deer, and smaller animals. They fished and gathered shellfish, seaweed, local plants including berries, nuts, seeds. Anything that they could find available that was edible. People weren't too fussy in those days. However, after a little bit of time, people did begin to start to farm animals and to farm food or to grow food. This led to the very first settlements and villages and eventually the first recognised society in Scotland, which was the ancient Picts. Now on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see a very, very early form of Scottish housing. Doesn't look particularly comfortable, does it? Turf roof and stone walls, but relatively effective at keeping out our not particularly wonderful weather. Now, not much at all is known about the Picts. They did have a language and they had art. However, most of the language is lost, so there's very little we can tell about them. What we do know about them was written by the Romans. So they did write and they did create art, and on the right-hand side of the screen you can see stone carvings that are artworks they made, very beautiful and very strange to our modern eye. They also made life very, very difficult for the Romans. Now the Romans did try and invade Scotland. They got all the way up to the Aberdeen area, but after several very bloody battles with the Picts, decided that it just wasn't worth it, and they retreated back south to an area called the Antonine Wall, which roughly speaking was a wall that stretches from Edinburgh to Glasgow, very crudely speaking. Now, what did the Picts eat? Well, they ate very similar foods to the earliest settlers, but they also raised cattle and they grew oats and they grew barley. So these two crops became absolutely central. They also, interestingly, invented beer, although it was very different from the modern beer that we know because it was made from heather. So thinking now about the Celts and the Vikings. Around 700 BC, the Celts began arriving in Scotland from Ireland, and they were forced to do this because of food shortages in Ireland. However, they didn't have that big an impact on what we were eating because it was very similar in Ireland in those days. However, it was the arrival of the Vikings sometime later, so we're now in AD, 800 AD, which had a much bigger effect on food, even as we know it today. So what did the Vikings bring with them? They brought a novel cooking method called smoking. So we can smoke meat, but also we can smoke fish. I don't know if anyone's tried Arbroath Smokies. It's smoked fish from Arbroath, very, very delicious. But you can go to pretty much any supermarket and buy smoked mackerel, for example. So we have the Vikings to thank for that kind of food. They also introduced the use of salt to preserve foods. And of course, we all know about this today. If you were to go to the shop and buy maybe a packet of bacon or a jar of olives, both of these things have salt in to improve the shelf life of the food. So it's very, very useful. We do know now, of course, that too much salt in the diet is not good for our health, particularly our blood pressure and our heart health. But the Vikings also interestingly brought Aberdeen Angus beef cattle to Scotland. Now, I think in those days they weren't actually called Aberdeen Angus, they were the Viking name. Well, that's the modern name. But however, this type of cow was brought to Scotland where it thrived. And also, it's thought that the Vikings introduced a very early form of haggis, that now stereotypical Scottish dish. But actually, haggis in one shape or another was eaten across much of Northern Europe and Northern Russia as well. So it wasn't a particularly Scottish thing, 1500 or 2000 years ago. So moving forward again in time, thinking about medieval Scotland. So during this time, people moved towards larger and larger villages. Many people were living not in castles, but around castles. So these were early towns. And Edinburgh is an example of that. We had the castle in the middle and the town sprang up around the castle. And during this time, food began to change a lot. Now we see two different stories. There was what the very wealthy ate, and there was what everyone else ate. Thinking about wealthier Scots first, and we're talking nobles and lairds, as lords to you and me, they could eat many newer foods, many of which were imported from abroad. They consumed huge amounts of meat, in fact, an unhealthy amount of meat, and they ate all sorts of things, some of which we don't eat these days. Rabbits, pigeons, peacocks, swans, boars, venison, which we do eat now, plus lots and lots of rich dairy. The flavouring of foods also advanced. So before this time, we didn't have a lot of flavouring. There might have been a bit of salt, and that was kind of it, maybe the old herbs that were picked locally. However, we saw much more usage of herbs and spices like pepper, mint, garlic, rosemary, and many others, and they became really common. The wealthy did consume lots of food, which was good, including what were then very exotic imports like grapes, but they also drank far too much rich alcohols, wine and claret. During this time, salt became increasingly expensive as it was used more and more and more. The population was growing, so the stocks of salt went down and it became dearer to purchase. So by this time, it was a real luxury. And in fact, our modern word salt comes from the French word sal, which means salary. So at certain times in history, salt was so valuable that people were actually paid. Now, wealthy people's diets were very, very rich and were thought to be a lot less healthy than ordinary people's food. So for less well-off Scots, food did remain humble and simple, although we were seeing big changes to it. Ordinary people would eat various types of oat breads, hard, soft, thick and thin, porridge made in different ways, stews and thick soups called pottage. Plant foods would include kale, beans, peas and onions, plus nuts, seeds and berries as well. And anyone who lived near the sea, so coastal people, would of course have plenty of seaweed, fish and shellfish, including oysters in their diet. Now, interestingly, in modern times, oysters are a very, very expensive food and slightly interesting to consume if anyone's ever had some. But in the past, they were incredibly cheap and they were the food of the poor. Their ground up shells actually also make excellent mortar, so the stuff you use to join bricks together when you're building a building. And most of Edinburgh's old town is actually built using oysters. Now, if you look at the older buildings and you look very, very closely, you might actually still see bits of whole oyster shell in the mortar between the stonework. So what do we eat in later medieval Scotland? So by the 16th century, we start to see dishes that we would recognise today. Yes, became very, very big. Black pudding, Scotch broth, Cullen skink, and scarlie. At the same time, due to Scotland's very close relationship with France, French cuisine started to heavily influence Scottish food and also Scottish language as well. So these Scottish words here, so collop and howtdowdy and stovies, all come from the French words. Not to mention also gardy loo. So if anyone knows anything about Edinburgh history, that's a very, very famous word from the French. It means watch out for the water. And it's what you shouted to the street below when you emptied your chamber pot toilet out of the window. And then, after some time, the potato arrived from the Americas. Although it was very expensive at first, it was a luxury food, it quickly became central to the Scottish diet because it grew very, very well here. And then people found that they needed much less land to grow potatoes, so this meant we could feed more people. Such classic Scottish dishes that include potatoes would be rumbleby thumps, which hopefully you've all made now as part of your Discover food box. Lang tatties, which just means long tatties, really. Champic tatties, which is essentially mashed potatoes, and colcannon and clapshot, 2 types of mash. We have other vegetables and butter and oil mixed in as well. Now, on to slightly less healthy matters. Scotland is famed for tooth. We've been eating a lot of sweet foods for a very long period of time. Now, this really originated in the 18th to 19th centuries as Scottish baking into its own. Tea rooms started to pop up across the country in small towns, big cities, all sorts, selling such delights as scones, pancakes, Dundee cake, shortbread, tablet, and other sweetened fancies. At about the same time, Scotland became central to the global sugar trade, and its sweetie industry became hugely important. So this would include favourites such as sour plums. I don't know if anyone's ever had them, they're quite nice and they are rather sour. And rock. So if you visited Edinburgh Castle, you might have bought some Edinburgh rock. Of course, our sweet tooth has continued to this day with notorious tooth and health problems. So it's just a little bit of what you fancy, but not too often and in smaller amounts is best. So thinking about modern Scotland. So we have long welcomed not only people from many nations, but also their foods as well. So we've long had large communities in Scotland of Italian, Pakistani and Chinese people who of course have brought their food culture and their heritage with them. They have also been joined by many newer arrivals from across the globe, bringing lots of exciting new tastes, new culinary ideas. So today we have a wonderful eclectic mix of traditional Scottish and international food, sometimes in the same dish. Has anyone ever had haggis bacora? It's absolutely not terribly healthy. So whether we're young, old, native or newcomer, we are all united by the experience and joy of food. It might sound like a silly thing to say, but all of us eat food. It's something every human being has got in common, and it's something we should share. So what can we do? Cooking at home. Most Scottish dishes are, to be fair, very, very easy to make and are especially suited to our inclement weather, our poor weather. So by now, many of you will have made the haggis with rumbleby thumps early, and we hope that you enjoyed them very, very much indeed. Oh, why not try one of these other dishes? We've got cullen skink, cranachan, clootie dumpling, Scotch broth, and there are lots of other Scottish dishes as well. So let's get involved and enjoy this lovely Scottish fare with lovely grown Scottish food, and also thinking a little bit about history. So if we do eat cullen skink, we're eating something that's been around for several hundred years. I just think that's a lovely fact. We connect with the people who used to live here, but eat in a modern way. Okay, that's it from me, folks. So I look forward to seeing you all at the next Discover coming up in April time. Until then, goodbye.